Hello, welcome to a new episode of 99ZUEINS. So we have the honor or the delight to have two guests on from the US who wrote a very nice little book called The People Are Not One. The people I'm going to invite now are Dr. Daniel Tutt. Tutt or Tutt?
Tutt.
Tutt. Okay, Dr. Daniel Tutt and C. Derick Varn from Varn's vlog. Pleasure to have you here. Quick sentence about the two of you. Dr. Daniel Tutt is a Marxist philosopher, critical theorist, and educator who earned his PhD under the prominent French philosopher Alain Badiou. He has extensive teaching experience across several academic institutions, including George Washington University and Marymount University, and has also taught philosophy classes inside the Washington, D.C. jail system. In addition to co-authoring The People Are Not One, he's the host of the Emancipations podcast and has written specialized books on psychoanalysis, family politics, and Friedrich Nietzsche. That's a good mixture. Did I miss anything?
No, it's very good. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay, nice.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks. It's great that you are here. We have C. Derick Varn. He's an American poet, educator, and political podcaster. He's the creator and host of Varn Vlog, a popular multimedia program dedicated to deep dive discussions on history, culture, and socialist politics. Alongside his political and theoretical writing with Daniel Tutt, Varn has published full-length poetry collections such as Apocalyptics and Liberation, and All the Other Bright, etc., etc. Nice. Did I miss anything there?
Not really, no.
No. Varn, I remember you from way back before we even started our own podcast. I saw my first exposure to you was a critique of Mark Fisher's Exiting the Vampire Castle. That's what I remember, and that was very important to me because it made a very, very clear point that part of the text is really good and part of it is really bad, and that was a very, very important takeaway for me.
Yeah, that's crazy. I wrote that actually over 12 years ago, so it's crazy to even think about it.
Yeah, it was the first time that I came across the name Varn, so kind of stuck with me because it left an impression. Great. The two of you wrote that little book, around 80 pages, called The People Are Not One. And I would say let's dive right into it and ask questions about this. I read it just this week, so it should be fresh in my memory. So the title is The People Are Not One. And I ask, what do you mean by that? Why is the concept of a homogeneous people not just a theoretical error, but a major strategic dead end for the left?
Well, I guess I can kick it off here. First of all, thank you for having us. It's a great honor. You know, I think the populist upsurge, the populist, what we call the populist horizon, refers to a tendency that seems almost hardwired into bourgeois politics since really the 1970s, where there is a tendency of a profound anti-elitist conception of class struggle, which has the tendency to render working class politics or socialist politics into a populist modality of analysis. So I think the first thing to state is the book is attempting a theoretical reclarification regarding class theory, right? So there's a certain error that's somehow embedded in left-wing politics, which is tied to the Popular Front. I'll let Derick talk about the history of the Popular Front, which we sort of hint at. We don't provide a full genealogical analysis of it, but that's sort of one origin point. There's also a big debate about what modern populism is in relationship to historical populism, populism in the age of post-mass politics, populism in the age of the gutting of civil society, the privatization of civil society, the emergence of third way liberalism, which is really a transformation in social democracy. So with the absence of a strong social democracy embedded within the electoral system in the Western governments, populism seems to be the inevitable horizon of militant or radical possibility. So our view, you know, as Marxists, as socialists, is that this constitutes a kind of theoretical blind spot. But of course, with that said, it's a certain noble element to the populist sentiment, because it's trying to connect with something righteous in the agitation that is sort of hardwired into our system, whether that be racial rebellions, like we saw with Black Lives Matter, whether that be the movement of the squares, or which really initiated with the alter globalization in the 90s. Populism seems to be this kind of ubiquitous. It's a ubiquitous way of thinking about popular struggle, but we see it as deeply flawed. Of course, this you're going to learn more about our critiques as we talk, but this is the idea that there needs to be a way of thinking about politics that is centering the working class. And we say that with full knowledge that class reductionism is actually a symptom of left populism. We would contend that the accusation of being a class reductionist, is itself very much a left populist problem. But anyways, I'll kick it to Derick for his insights there.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of the people seems to be foundational to bourgeois politics. We see it as early as the 17th century. The 19th century populist, we have our two major case examples. We don't go into very much in the book, but they were very much on our mind, which is the American populist movement, which was a movement that a lot of the early members of the Socialist Party were actually involved in. It emerged in the United Midwest, in areas that were heavily implicated by sharecropping. And then we also we're thinking about the Narodniki movement in Russia, which had a similar agrarian base, although peasant, not sharecropping, and an intellectual base, with the intellectuals really the leadership of both movements. The reason why we find the people as a strategic dead end is that it's inherently class collaborationist and often built on coalitions with classes that may be unstable or easily made dependent on state powers. We can think about Marx's analysis of, what he called the lumpen, and the petite bourgeoisie, and the rise of Louis Napoleon. But we can also look at the People's Party in the United States, which had a strong basis of sharecroppers that kind of just got made economically irrelevant with changes in the structure of agriculture in the United States. So to tie that into the Popular Front a bit, the populist in the U.S. basically liquidated with Williams Jennings Bryan into the Democratic Party around the turn of the 19th and the 20th century, and that set a pattern of seeing the Democratic Party as the party that people could enter into to shift American politics. And that actually was a big difference from the 19th century, where Marx really thought the Republican Party was the party that if you were going to have any allegiance with, because it was the party of, at the time, the progressive bourgeoisie, that you might have to have a tactical alliance with. But Marx would have never advocated socialists and communists just become, Republicans. The issue that happens is in the United States is in the 30s, the communists in the U.S. are all over the place because of the shifts in the Kommentaren. But by 39 and 40, you have the CPUSA entering an alliance with the Democratic Party because of the Soviet Union's alliance with the United States. And this also sets a pattern of everyone channeling into one of the two parties here. And I know most Europeans understand American politics better than Americans understand European politics, but just as a reminder, we don't have a parliamentary system here. So it is very hard for outside parties to form allegiances or have much pull on the national level, and this frustrated the socialists and the communists to no end. The CPUSA went back and forth in different time periods in the 20th century about whether or not it was an allegiance with the Democratic Party or whether or not it should run its own candidates. The Socialist Party had a similar problem, and basically by the 60s liquidated itself into the Democrats too. But this created a pattern of seeing socialism as something you really do by affecting bourgeois political parties' policies. And this required a class collaborationist framework to work. So you had to make appeals to elements of the bourgeoisie, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In the background, you also have the Sino-Soviet split, China's new democracy, and all these are being brought kind of inappropriately to the United States as models to use for us, even though, you know, Mao would have never suggested that, actually. And so that also created this idea that the people were like an extension of the mass line, was the same thing as talking about, like, I don't know, the dictatorship of the proletarian peasantry or something. I also think, and you know, we'll get into this a little bit more later, that the changes in the way the economy was orchestrated made this just a lot more appealing, because shifts in production made large-scale unions outside of the public sector much harder in the U.S., considering also that sectional bargaining was more or less made illegal by the Taft-Hartley Act in the 50s. So, as was a bunch of other things. So, like, a lot of the strategies of the European labor movement were legally foreclosed to the American labor movement. And what you saw then after that was labor leadership more and more tied towards the Democratic Party, towards certain industries in particular that were more forgiving or had the profit base to sustain unions. And as that went away, you both had anti-union sentiment in the public for, you know, about 30 years, but also the unions were much, much less effective. They could not shut down as much during a strike. So strike actions were, you know, more limited. And I think that led us to where we are today.
You already touched some of the things, but to go into more detail also, you describe populism as a phenomenon deeply embedded into the mature neoliberal era and the decline of mass politics since the late 1970s. In what ways is contemporary populism less a radical break from the system and more a direct symptom of its internal decay?
Well, we get into this through the conception of Stuart Hall and his famous argument in regards to the notion that Thatcherism gave birth to this kind of strategy for managing social antagonisms. It's called the moral panic. Today in the US, and I guess since US culture is exported globally, you probably have the same idea of what we call the culture wars. So, now, Stuart Hall, we don't fully accept his thesis because he is of the view that the culture war sort of moral contagion problematic embedded in neoliberalism gives rise to an authoritarian populism. And this is interesting because even before Stuart Hall, like take a thinker like Richard Hofstadter during the Cold War was arguing, in fact, that populism stands for an authoritarian backlash to liberal status quo politics. So in a sense, the populist threat was seen during the Cold War compact as a sort of really a reflection of the authoritarian personality of the working class. You know, we could even invoke Adorno's studies of the authoritarian personality here as well. And Christopher Lasch, who's a thinker, the American historian and cultural critic, is a thinker that's very important to Derick and I. And we try to perform a Marxist reanalysis of Christopher Lasch, because one of the things he was very clear on, even going back to the late 50s and early 60s, right, was to push against this Cold War consensus that populism is authoritarian, because he argued that underneath that thesis was an argument that the working class is somehow intrinsically authoritarian. So he rejects that, and we reject that thesis as well. But we still see this all the way running up to, the Graham Plattner controversy. Of course, we do not support Graham Plattner whatsoever, but the notion that embedded in the populist threat is an authoritarianism, however you theorize, that is a big thesis. This is why we see populism as a species of Bonapartism, because even in the left-wing version of populism, say the work of Ernesto Laclau, it's still necessary that a leader function as the organizer of the masses. But the conception that the populist relies on to understand the masses, we see as a kind of pandering or passive-aggressive conception of the masses. It's really one that is looking down on the masses. And this is why populism, in our vision, in our point of view, is very copacetic to liberalism. Because liberalism has that same hierarchy embedded. It's that same anti-masses conception. So in a sense, the populist ideal, right, of how it conceives of the masses is a bit misleading, because it's not really understanding the fragmentation of class antagonisms that riddles the people, right? The people are not one. The people are not a homogeneous entree that somehow elites or counter-elites can manipulate, right? So in a way, the populist becomes the kind of inverse of the technocrat. Both the technocrat and the populist have a kind of condescending idea of the people, we would argue. Or maybe, if not condescending, an imprecise vision. And this is where, we think that class analysis becomes essential. And we're not trying to claim that it's easy work to arrive at a good theory of class analysis, but we are claiming that it's missing, that left populism is very happy to kind of generalize the class phenomenon. And this is why you get the culturalization of class, right? And the expression of class through cultural symbols and cultural codes, which we are very much opposed to. I'll kick it to Varn for further thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about this in a few ways. Mass politics is in my mind, is actually a product of crisis, and I'm pretty sure Daniel would agree with me. But it's usually a product of acute crisis. The kinds of crises you see leading up to World War I, major depressions, etc. Today, we're in a different kind of crisis. I mean, arguably, Europe, the United States, UK, Canada, Japan have been in a sort of secular stagnation / slow decline since the 1970s. And we think that is tied to the rise of this new form of populism. And so there's a couple of things that I think flow from that. One is, while we think that the accusation that the class base behind populism is authoritarian is wrong, we do see some of the outlines of Stuart Hall's argument that the contradictions in the classes that make up that base, they're fundamentally opposed interest in certain areas, leads to either a shift of focus to cultural concerns that do not actually address the interest, but can have a broad base because they appeal to many different kinds of subjectivities that are often responding to real problems, but there are no real solutions to the problems on offer. Or it can become more authoritarian at the leadership level, aka a Bonapartist kind of figure, because it would take a highly authoritarian state to rein the interest in by basically just shutting people up. But we see in right populism right now both tendencies. And left populism, we see more of the bait and shift. I mean, when we talk about Graham Plattner, for example, this is already becoming a culture war issue. And you can even see right-wing opponents of Graham Plattner now jump on the bandwagon to support him to alienate progressives more, even though he's already left the field of politics, like he resigned yesterday. And I find this to be predictable from our theory about the various class bases. And Plattner himself actually kind of represents this in a person. He's from a middle class family, an upper middle class family. He himself is actually not particularly well off. He probably makes less than me, but he's a petite bourgeois oyster farmer who used to be a mercenary and a soldier. And
he's also the one with the tattoo that kind of was a small scandal.
Yes, the token,
a huge scandal.
Tattoo. Yeah, it's
a huge scandal. I only saw it like through social media, so it did not have the same impact on me that it had on probably you guys because you're in the US. But so
this brings me to this actually is relevant because one of the things I heard from the populist is that working class people are too stupid to know what a token cough is. And me as a person who I used to work at a military academy. I've been a corrections officer. That's a fancy word we use in America for prison guard. So I have a lot of interaction with police in the military in my early past. And I was like, no, they for sure know what that is. Like it's Gnostic significations were something that people knew, both pro and con, in that community, regardless of whether or not they had a college education, which also Plattner had. So it was one of these things where I was like, so your defense of the nobility of the working class is to call them stupid in a context where they absolutely would know. Like, this man was in Croatia when this happened. And even if he didn't know when he got it or he was drunk or whatever, I can buy all that. And I don't, I think people should be able to recover from that kind of mistake. But the thing is, he claimed he just did not know up until a few days before the scandal came out. And I was like, there's no way I believe that. But I think what offended me about it, even more so than the actual thing, is like, I don't think he's a secret Nazi because he got a dumb tattoo. I actually understand the culture of the military in the United States. What bothers me about it was the contempt that the populists who support the working class were illustrating they had for the working class. That they just didn't think any sector of this class would know something that I knew from a video game when I was 16.
Yeah, everybody played Wolfenstein.
Right.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I can reciprocate here because most of the time I talk to people who are very much in favor of populism. It's always about dumbing down, like literally dumbing down the critique that we have of bourgeois, capitalist, or nation-state society. It's like, no, don't go all in. Like they won't get that. Why?
And also we should say that the compromise has an ideological element that's very significant, which is that the left populist will tend to sacrifice its ideological alliance, its allegiance to liberalism, which is why at the end of the controversy of Plattner, the first round, when his Reddit was exposed, where he was a private, so he was kind of expressing his Freudian id, and at the end of it, he apologized for his leftism and his socialism, and he renounced it. The conclusion from that is that for left populists, this is a prerequisite for doing bourgeois politics. Right? So you have kneecapped, you have converted socialism into an infantile adolescent expression, which is exactly what liberalism wants socialism to be. That's the precondition to play in the arena of this left populist game. We saw this happen with Sanders too.
In Germany, we have the same example. A couple of years back, when Janina Wissler became like one of the heads of the German Left Party, she was active in the Trotskyist movement, which is by any definition left-wing radicalism, and she had to renounce every allegiance and membership and pretend that she like barely even touched those people with a 10-foot pole before being eligible for leadership of the left party, not Democrats. Like Plattner tried to get in bed with the Democrats. She tried the left party. Even for that, it was just too steep a staircase. So, anything more you want to reiterate on this, or should we just move on with questions?
No, I think this is good.
Good. Then we already talked about Plattner because I was so confused the first times when I heard the term PMC from the US, because for me it was always private military contractor, and that made no sense whatsoever in the discussions that I was hearing. But back to your topic, a pivotal theme in your book is the role of the professional managerial class, PMC. Yeah, that was my mistake. You argue that the PMC does not constitute a distinct class proper, but is rather a contradictory segment of the new petty bourgeois. Why is this definitional distinction so crucial, and how do intra-class rivalries within this stratum shape today's culture wars?
Yeah, that's a lot. Well, let me kick it off, and I'll then share the floor with Derick Varn. We recognize that in the post-war period, the rise of the new middle class is an inescapable feature of political life. Capitalism has some restructuring. Some give this the name of neo-capitalism. The idea is that the new middle class has an ascendancy that usurps the industrial proletariat, and therefore Marxism needs to be rethought. Maybe, right? Maybe this is actually a false thesis, in fact. Within that, there emerges a technical, bureaucratic, professional strata that is supported by the state, but is also supported by excess and surplus of capital for a particular period of time. Some people call this the golden age of capitalism, from the 50s up through the early 70s. And this force, this bureaucratic force of what was originally theorized as what was called the new class, initiated famously by the former Trotskyist reactionary James Burnham, right? In his book, The Managerial Revolution, they become and they shape the contours of post-war politics in profound ways. The Ehrenreichs, Barbara and John Ehrenreich, historians, sociologists, put forward the argument. There's a lot of different ways to read their argument, but they put forward the argument that an element within the PMC needs to be thought as intrinsically a progressive force for achieving left-wing aims and goals. It's something like a attempt to, we were just having a conversation with Mike McNair, who is a Marxist thinker from the UK that we respect quite a lot. And he referred to Ehrenreich's intervention and the coinage of the PMC label as itself, in an interesting way, a version of the merger thesis. In fact, the merger thesis being the question about how intellectuals form the socialist movement with the working class. And so in a sense, it was a quite optimistic theory initially, that the PMC can function as a kind of mediator of working class demands. What we've seen since the rise of neoliberalism in the 70s till now is a profound regression in regards to this thesis. And what we've seen is, in fact, this class becoming more victim of austerity, more irrational, and less capable of playing that mediating function. So something has gone awry with the PMC thesis. And, I'll kick it to Derick here, but, the question is that the neoliberal period sort of deflates the Ehrenreich's optimism. One of the things I want to say, though, is that we want to retain a bit of that optimism because we see that the professional and the petty bourgeois has to be thought in terms of class strata. And the fragmentation internal to the PMC is a significant fragmentation. We analyze that through Polancis, the great Marxist theoretician Nikos Polancis, who gives us a kind of way, I think, to see the ideology of the new petty bourgeoisie is it internally fractured. And if you homogenize this class, you kind of perform a vulgar theory of superstructure. You kind of have almost like a quasi-neo-Stalinist theory that all PMC and that thereby the immediacy of their class position results in a homogenous ideological worldview. We get a lot of that theory in today's left. And this leads to a perpetuation of the fake liberal populist culture war politics. So we want to find a way out of that. While recognizing that within the PMC are class traders and militants and socialists, that something there has to be extracted or subtracted from what is the consensus, I think. And, Catherine Liu is correct that there is a kind of liberal progressive fatalism of the PMC in general. But we have the view, and I'll kick it to Varn, that, there has to be another way to pry open the PMC question. And so we use Polancis to do that. I'll kick it to Derick.
Yeah, we went back and forth a lot on this in particular, looking for theorists that we thought could help us through this impasse. And when Daniel found Polancis was writing on this, which I was vaguely familiar with, but not particularly till revisiting it for the book, it was kind of a breath of fresh air. But for me, there was a footnote in an otherwise terrible article by Kristen Parenti about the nature of what he was calling the professional managerial class, which is not a class. And his footnote, which I found interesting, is he noted that the professional managerial class had expanded dramatically between 1970 and the 2000s. And that Ehrenreich had noticed, Barbara Ehrenreich, not so much John, although John has commented on it recently, had noticed that this was already as late as the 1990s causing a division, because what the function of credentialization had changed. And so credentialization in the 60s and 70s was sold to a lot of former workers that their children would be able to go into management or into the civil service, which is just the civil service is a way, kind of a social management position. And that what had also happened in the 80s and 90s during neoliberalization is there seemed to be lots of quote unquote surplus labor, a lot of whom could not be eaten up by basically the US prison system, to be quite vulgar and frank about it. There was a big push to start sorting people with additional credentialization. So you see jobs that used to just require like a high school degree, diploma, or not even that. Like you just had to pass a literacy test, start requiring up to and including a master's degree. And that created an expansion of the category. And what I looked at before even writing this book, when I was debating this new PMC thesis, which was really revised and revisited pretty strongly leading up to the failure of the Sanders campaign in 2020. So Catherine Liu's book was written a little bit before that, but it pops off and is used as almost a myth to explain why Sanders lost. And there's some truth to it, actually. There does seem to be an attempt that Sanders did to court young professionals and to get a younger crowd by picking up progressive cultural tokens to get young people. And the evidence is actually that it had no effect or it didn't work. It's hard to say causally, but his vote with young people went down the more he picked up these talking points. So it's not just he lost more of the general vote, he lost more of the vote he was specifically aiming for with this move.
He lost the target group.
Right. Or at least didn't grow it. So we looked at that later, but when we were looking at this, we started going, okay, so what's going on with this professional managerial class? Why does it seem like a class and isn't one? And Polanskis gave us a way to look at their relationship to the petty bourgeoisie, because historically in the United States, a lot of these positions really they weren't like spiritually or morally petite bourgeois. They were just petite bourgeois. You owned your own practice. You owned your own means of production, which was your credential and your brain, and you sold it directly to a consumer. In the 1980s, this starts to also reverse. So more and more parts of this grouping that are not in the public sector start getting turned into salaried employees, doctors, nurses, et cetera, et cetera. We'd already seen the proletarianization of like teachers and nurses. And that's been a well-studied phenomenon. And that's the vast majority actually of most of the people in this. The other thing that Daniel and I started looking at is the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States actually pointed out that while industrial output's actually fairly high, the deindustrialization can be a misleading name because it's deindustrialization of the workforce, but it isn't deindustrialization of production. There's still lots of industrial production. It just, a factory that used to require 2,000 people now requires 50 to 150. And so the scaling down is massive after automation. And this together means that you have to appeal to this large group of service sector workers who are also fairly educated. And what you've seen with a lot of this cultural stuff is two things. One is we start assuming that anyone who has a college education is culturally liberal. And while I agree with Daniel, it's totally true for the liberal consensus is educated. But the reverse isn't true, that all these educated people are liberals. And the other thing is that the reason for the radicalization of this strata of society is different in the 20 teens than it was in the 1960s and 70s. In the 1960s and 70s, it seemed like they were radicalized partly because they were the people with leisure time. And the aught teens, they seem to be radicalized because they were being, to some degree, proletarianized. And what Daniel and I noticed, and why we still thought Polanskis was so useful, although there is a kind of bridge with Pierre Bourdieu here, is we noticed that the institutions that support all these groups, colleges, civic institutions, the professional unions, the professional organizations, the lobbying groups, the continuing education groups outside of the university, all actually operate under the assumption that these people are still basically petite bourgeois and selling their services directly, even though that is not the case. So they are enculturated as petite bourgeois. And the other thing that you see is like the more traditional petite bourgeois, is that they're highly dependent on actions by the state, but the actions by the state that they're dependent on are the opposite of a lot of the like rural petite bourgeois. And this drives a lot of the culture war talking points. So you have this urban versus rural phenomenon tied into these stratas of the class. But a lot of these, the reason why we're hopeful is actually almost economic. It's that a lot of these people are being radicalized and turned into class raiders, some out of their conscience, but a lot of them because they're just becoming proletarianized. And so that leads to this strata here where you have this petite bourgeois, like rural thing that's going hard on cultural signifiers of blue collar nature, although they are often relatively well off. They usually make more than the median or even the average income in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. But they're not rich. And then you have this traditionally also well-off professional strata that is increasingly dependent on the state, and the state is attacking them directly. And something that Daniel noted outside of the book, but it's been on my mind too, is after 2020, there was this idea both on the left and the right that this group of professionals were almost undefeatable and they ran society, right? The way they were spoken about is like they had a hegemony over culture, and that was like everything. And Daniel has pointed out many times, and I'll let him speak to this, that like Doge and the actual bourgeoisie defeated them in about a month as far as their political capacity goes. Like they just had them fired en masse. And they were so disorganized, and Daniel can speak to this more to me because he's in DC. I'm out in the hinterlands. That there wasn't even a proper political response once it happened, really. Like there was, liberals complaining about it, but there wasn't even like massive protests in the same way that we've seen in other areas, or calls for strikes. It didn't happen. And I'm going to turn it back over to Daniel.
Yeah,
interesting going on.
I think this is a good point. I mean, in a way, the Ehrenreich thesis as the PMC as the mediator of the class still remains true, but it's become so irrational and convoluted that it has become ensnared in these culturalist frameworks of thinking about the working class, where you get, Jacobin magazine insisting on a kind of opining, nostalgic vision of the hard hat working class, as if this is still a kind of viable way to think about majoritarian working class experience. It's not, which is fine. I don't mean to isolate Jacobin. I think much of what they do is great. So within the PMC is a very paradoxical situation of the problem of interest. This is related to the bourgeoist theory of the petty bourgeois habitus that seems to envelop the PMC problem, which, of course, one of the things we talk about is the theory of the new class. And one of the ideas before Ehrenreich was that Hegel had this notion of the bureaucrat as the universal class. And this was meant to refer to a class, and we even see this stretching back in early socialism of Saint-Simon and so on, of a kind of benevolent, indifferent bureaucrat who has a register of speech which has transcended class codes, right? And this problem still persists to this day. I think Derick's point about Elon Musk coming in and trying to destroy the bureaucratic class, what was so interesting about it was that it produced zero politicization of that bureaucratic class, because they don't see themselves as a class. It's a highly atomized group, in fact, composed of heterogeneous class groups and so on. But the point is that from within its institutional block, because that institutional block is so dominated by private interests, by financial oligarchs, by nonprofits and NGOs, and by liberal ideology, we contend that those institutions are no longer capable of functioning as kind of arbiters of working class interests. While at the same time, we should note, in the wake of Mamdani, there has been an injection of socialistic thinking, which we don't want to say, oh, you don't know anything about socialism, you're PMC, like this kind of culture, right wing. No, of course not. We welcome that. We welcome that with full acknowledgement that a lot of theoretical work into the history of socialism and Marxism still needs to actually take place, where you get this kind of liberal socialism where it's kind of very easy, almost like an identity marker, And the fact that Mamdani attracts a base which is very akin to what Obama attracted is actually somewhat worrying, to be honest, because it indicates that he may be fated or destined to a urban PMC form of expansion, where his thought cannot expand beyond that, which is actually what the Democratic establishment wants, of course. They want to contain him to New York. But the point is that the debate about the PMC revolves around this representational debate. Do we as the left support minorities, right? Minority-driven struggles, or do we support broad-based universalist working class struggles? Part of the problem there is the institutional problem, because the vantage point by which we're saying that presupposes that we can only speak about the working class as if they're out there, right? This goes to the question, I think, of the merger thesis, which is more than just how do you bring organic intellectuals in line with workers, or how do you make workers organic intellectuals? There also seems to us a necessity to revisit what institutions that will be able to be beyond this representational problem. What would that look like? Because we see that as leading to a lot of errors and a lot of problems and a lot of strange ideas of the proletariat emerge, very kind of anti-materialist conceptions. So that would be what I would say. But at the same time, the Doge thing, I've studied enough Freud to know that there's a certain latency period. So the fact that they lashed out at the bureaucrats and they lost, even though it hasn't politicized them now, we may see the reverberations of it down the road. So it's not over. It's not over. Because they set up camps in DC and nobody came, like protest camps. Nobody came. So it was not a politicizing event for the bureaucratic class.
You offer a sharp critique of the contemporary left, getting bogged down in moral contagion and sectarianism, which is, I think, also part of that cultural war or culture war thing. What do you mean by that? How can a serious socialist movement emancipate itself from those behavioral patterns?
Well, you mentioned Mark Fisher's Vampire Castle essay. That might be an interesting place to start, even though, of course, we recognize how polemical and problematic,
populist,
how populist that text is. Yeah, because the big error there is he seems to want to fetishize the category of class origins in a moralistic way, which I think
he actually plays identity politics with working class. That's
No, it's very sad. However, what I find interesting about Fisher's point, I think it's going to go directly to your question, is that the disgruntled petty bourgeois rebel who lionized Fisher, who adored Fisher because of his investments into French theory and Deleuze and Guattari and all of that kind of ludic countercultural 60s rebellion and so on. They saw him as a split figure between this kind of traditional working class guy and one who could speak to the 60s counterculture. And they tried to own like the Levi's jeans with the two horses pulling it this side to this side. That's like Mark Fisher. And I think that this debate still obviously permeates the institutional life of the left. The problem is the problem of what I have referred to and what we refer to as counterpublic. So this idea of the counterpublic from queer theory in about the 80s. And of course, the Kluge and Knecht, in their very, very interesting work, the German theoreticians, you're probably familiar with them, have this idea of the proletarian public sphere. So we get at the problem of the irrationalism of the left public sphere through both Fisher, but also Kluge and Knecht, and this notion of counterpublic, whereby most of what happens on the left is actually a paternalism that is driven by the context of the institutional forces that only seem to accelerate logics of competition. Say, for example, in the public sphere of the social media for the left, so much of the antagonism is driven by a reflection of the broken university system, especially in intellectual discourses. So you experience this acute sense of competition and a kind of lack of any comradely concern. And it's a highly unproductive situation. where sort of ideological differences, class differences, and the meat or the substance of what we're trying to do gets lost. Solidarity gets lost. So it becomes a highly atomized branding exercise that's this individualist, faded to an individualist problem. Fisher, in his essay, Vampire Castle, I think was right to say this is driven by the privatization of the public sphere.
Mm-hmm.
What Kluge and Knecht gave us was a way to think about an alternative to that. Even though they have very little practical advice for exactly how to construct it, something like in the measure of labor union and socialist parties would be the way, where forms of education, socialist night school, socialist community organizations, forums that are subtracted from the pressures of this privatization world would be one way we would think about some kind of transcendence of some of these petty squabbles. Because it creates a weird situation in which the conflicts on the left, when you look at them from on high, or when you detach yourself from them, you lose any clear sense of what was the cause? What was the cause? Why did this happen?
Mm.
And nobody knows. And that's why one day this side is seeming to be on top, and then the next day they're on the bottom. It's very erratic, and there's forces of manipulation that push and pry to accelerate this kind of paternalistic competition. So that fractures the left, I would argue. This is something we care a lot about, and we kind of try to hint at how to, I suppose, the existence of our podcasts are an attempt to try to do something different. But Varn, maybe with all of that, please jump in.
Yeah, my theories are very similar to Daniel's. The Counterpublic was more Daniel in the book, but it really got me thinking about what it is we do. The two key words that kind of blew up in the aught teens around this were dual power and base building. That kind of faded pretty quickly going into the Biden administration around the left, but I do want to parse out why they came up and why they were insufficient, and it's a different way of getting at the same problem that Daniel's talking about. Fisher's insight in the Vampire Castle and why I voted to publish it when I was on the collective of the North Star that published it 16 years ago, or however long it was, not quite 16 years ago, I think 14, was that he was right about the gatekeeping function of a lot of liberal ideology, and its codes. To go back to something that Daniel said earlier, that a lot of these codes are about seeming to perform originlessness. So a lot of the social codes are foreign to everyone's speech because they don't have a class origin really on purpose. But people get that as an imposition on their identity. And it becomes a way of social control in very small spheres. But it's social control that is actually in some ways an admission of a lack of power. When you really think the primary battle is about, I don't know, linguistic justice and policing what people say, that's usually because you don't have any other levers to pull on social change. You have actually the causality, in my opinion. I can't prove it 100%. You can't prove any of this 100%. But in my opinion, you have the causality backwards. That the language reflects the social reality almost more than the social reality is informed by the language. There is a feedback loop, but it is not an equal feedback loop.
It's a fraction.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So how can a serious socialist movement emancipate itself from these behavior patterns? One, And this is very hard to get people to do. Fisher struggled with it in his writing very profoundly. I think Fisher actually is an interesting case study here because his essays oscillate on this. Sometimes he thinks that we should embrace proletarian culture, but by that, what he actually means without even really realizing it is capitalist constructions of proletarian culture sold to the proletariat as a marketing demographic. I've actually had this problem with Jameson too, where they start talking about proletarian culture, and I'm like, well, but that's not really proletarian culture. That is culture mass marketed to the proletariat. The other thing that sometimes he would advocate is standing above it, and taking a line, beyond capitalist realism and all this. And so he was at odds with himself, in my opinion, of reading him and knowing him, on how we should approach this pattern. I have always said that socialists should not be particularly concerned about being woke or anti-woke. Like, we need to be above these cultural battles and look at what is making these cultural battles viable for most people, and not trying to pick sides on the good form or the bad form, because when I talk to liberals and left populists on this, and a lot of people we call left populists actually get a little mad that we call them left populists. We can talk about that later. But when you look at something like BLM, there was a response by a certain sector of people. It's like, oh, this doesn't concern the workers, and I'm like, it's really about the lumpen, our liberal culture wars, or both. And our take on this is like, no, there's something very interesting to study in these riots turn into social movements and how they move through different class fractions. And if a socialist movement was going to be serious about this, it would be looking at the causes: police violence, deindustrialization. I mean, if you look at where Black Lives Matter emerges twice, it can be summarized as following. It starts in the center of the country that is the most deindustrialized and also fairly Black, and ends in the financial sectors and the tech sectors of the richest areas in the country that are racially diverse, but actually slightly more white than not. And that happens multiple times in the 20 teens. And a socialist movement should be watching why that's happening. Like, why is it starting in the place it's starting and ending in the place it's ending, instead of trying to go, well, this is good or bad. No, this is there's something very real. There's real social antagonisms here that are also being funneled in a particular way. And when I would point to this, I was, you will talk about all these victories for like anti-racist struggles or whatever. And I'd be like, well, during the same time period, just looking at Black workers. So we're not even framing this as a workers only problem. Specifically, Black workers, public and private sector, man and woman, and anything else. And what we can see is wages and wealth stuff stagnated or got worse during the period of the highest point of public representation after these various riots. So during the period of Barack Obama, up through the period of BLM, and up until about 2022, aggregate Black wealth was stagnant or declining, depending on what part of the country you were on. And this was particularly hitting the Black working class and, for lack of a better word, the lumpenized sections of the Black working class really hard. At the same time that you're seeing this politics of representation going on. And so part of our point is that this politics of representation doesn't do anything. And a socialist movement needs to look at that and say, okay, fine, you've done all this. It didn't do anything for the majority of Black workers. We can, by fixing stuff for all workers, we can fix stuff for Black workers too. Are we going to get rid of interpersonal bigotry? No. That's a cultural issue will have to be worked out, and we need to work it out. We don't deny that that's a problem. But in fact, it's a big problem for organizing. But it's not something that it's something that if we took care of the wealth and income disparities, got rid of private property altogether, I don't know, would be a lot more addressable and figuring out what is actually that issue. Whereas this representation politics doesn't address the key thing that is immiserating a lot of these people's lives. And so I think a socialist movement has to go, we are going to figure out what proletarian culture is, but more than that, all right, we're not just going to accept it as it is right now. We're going to find out where it's at from being involved in it, not just, sociological studies, and then try to push it in a new formation. Because the other thing that we kind of contend quietly, but the noble suffering of the working class actually is not all that noble, and it makes elements of the working class a lot harder to organize because of the social pathologies that you're dealing with. And we have to acknowledge that without shaming people or blaming people for how they ended up in that situation. And that's something the socialist movement should do. And that would get them out of a lot of these culture war patterns.
It's very difficult because the representational capacities of liberal institutions, we know, will not be willing or capable to scale out a project that would viably represent the working class. I think in that sense, we would have to acknowledge that. Now, there are some, like EndNotes and the communization folks that we criticize in the book, in a comradely way, of course, who argue that any representational politics of the working class is fated to reproduce the old errors and produce a kind of fascism in some sense, they would say, So that's the careful dance that one has to do, which is not extinguish or move away from representation to court, but to insist upon, and this is where ideological struggle, I think, comes into, and ideological analysis comes into play. And frankly, pedagogy and education, about politics, about class politics, actually becomes essential, not only for the working class, but also for the liberal PMC people too. It goes both ways. Because there's a tendency of bourgeois politics to become very hyper, and we see this forming right now with Mamdani, where you can already see the trappings of a whiplash that will happen because the bourgeoisie will inject an optimism, which they will control, and then at a moment they will deflate it. When that all comes crashing down, what are you going to do? You're going to become a scapegoat.
You're going to blame the DEI people, for example.
But you will also become a scapegoat for the center to use, and they will do that. So they will create a party for you, then they will cancel it and blame you for something that's not your fault. Class-independent politics has the advantage to not get caught within the crosshairs of bourgeois scapegoating. I recognize, there's legal barriers to creating a third party and a Marxist party. But of course, I think at the heart of our book, the energy of our work, is a kind of historical force to say that we do need something like that, in fact. That we do need something like that. How we build that, it's a question. But that's, I think, where I reside. And I mean, I know Derick is a member of the DSA, and I'm happy that he is. And, I'm not. But we have a certain sense that something like a Marxist party or a third party is, I think, something maybe it's something we can talk about. I don't know. So.
But as a separate organization from the established ones, that's what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah. Which, of course, can also entail experimentation. Experimentation in civil society, experimentation with educational efforts, this is not something we would ever. No, we want to see more of that. Scale that out, right, as a priority. Yeah, before, and there might even be some kind of causal link between the strengthening of civil society and the construction of something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to loop back a little bit to the state of the working class, because when looking at the working class today, you also in your book you note that the traditional base in manufacturing has drastically shrunk to global overcapacity and deindustrialization. The modern proletariat is heavily fragmented across service, gig, and care sectors. What are the consequences here for class organization?
I'll speak to that one first.
Please,
I'll pass it
please.
to Daniel. So it's a little different in Europe and the United States, but the difference is one of scale, not kind, with a few exceptions in the Scandinavian countries where there is a slight difference in kind because of the successfulness of sectional bargaining. But even that, I'm going to put with a big pin on it because I see the skepticism in your face. I also am skeptical because we've seen neoliberalism hit there too. It's just not, with the exception of Sweden, it's not quite as profound. It probably will be though, as basically Europe starts to freak out about certain other geopolitical concerns and has to redirect a lot of funds into the military. But that aside, I would look at the United States as a paradigmatic definition here. So you're right. In the U.S., the productive sector of the industrial proletariat has shrunk from about, 35-40% in the 50s. It's never been the majority. Mm-hmm. Down to about 8% if you factor out management in the Bureau of Labor Statistics data. You also have had for a long time before the apps. I want to be very clear on this. People tend to blame the technology. Mm-hmm. The technology made it easier, but it was already happening as early as the mid-aughts. And that was turning things that had traditionally been employees into contractors to get around benefits requirements under the law. I saw this as early as 2000. I saw hospital workers being turned into contractors so they could not be given insurance. And this got even worse, actually, after the ACA gave people an option on the public market privately. And now that those subsidies are gone, that's not affordable for most people anyway. But to get back to this fragmentation, the largest, most successful unions in the United States are all public sector. Only 7% of the private sector in the United States is unionized. In the entire OECD, union density has declined. Not as profound as the US, but it has for a variety of reasons. The populists tend to blame this on ideology. They tend to have an ideological narrative that neoliberals came around. And unfortunately, they got it from Marxist. I shouldn't gatekeep who's a Marxist, but from people like David Harvey, who convinced everybody that neoliberalism was primarily a political program, which it was, but it was a political program that was able to take advantage of a particular crisis. And that crisis was not manufactured by the neoliberals. And that means a couple of things. There are very few mass organs for organization that dip much out of the public sector. So to tie it back to that professional strata problem, the unions are also dominated by the professional strata, both in their staffers and in the largest unions that exist. I remember there were calls for the AFL-CIO to kick out the police unions because the police unions aren't even covered by the National Labor Relations Act in the United States. They're a separate thing. And I don't want to get too technical for a German audience and get into the nuances of American labor law, but it is kind of important. But they wouldn't kick the police unions out despite all their misgivings, particularly in the late teens after the first round of BLM protests and insurrections, because it was alternating with the teachers union as the largest union sector in the organization. That's very hard for Marxists to do much with. Marxists, do you have a lot of sway in the nurses union, actually, and in the teachers unions, in some indirect ways? There's not like large Marxist organizations in the schools. That's a myth. But they have been able to support them in the teens. But they have not been able to do that in the private sector. Conversely, most salting attempts to go into a workforce by activists to get it to form a union has been at small shop service sector things like Starbucks. You hear a lot about it. And it has been kind of successful in the getting the union recognized stage. It has not been successful in contracts because the leverage isn't there. When you have unions that in the United States are going to be, if it's by firm for some of these Starbucks unions, your union might be 15, 20 people. If it's by the city, it might be 200 or 300. That is nothing compared to an industrial union in the 1950s and 60s. The unions, the traditional private sector unions, have largely tried to grow not by growing capacity in their traditional jurisdictions, but by going into things like organizing teachers' aides in universities, which is ideal for them in two ways. One, those people will pay union dues, but they're never going to take union leadership because they're not going to be in long enough because the job is temporary. And two, it gets them tied into the public service sector where they feel safer. You saw this with the UAW. You've seen it. And actually, weirdly, in the United States, you have all these unions that are attached to other fields traditionally trying to organize college assistants because they see it as a way to stabilize. That radically changes how you can organize. Salting is less effective. And it's even less effective now with social media and AI because you can identify a salter by doing a basic profile search and aggregating it under an AI. It takes 30 seconds. And so they don't get hired. So that whole strategy, which is based on a mid-20th century strategy and has been revived in the teens, has had no effect on labor density. None. They're like less. In fact, we've lost labor density since it's been started. What we do have in the United States is public opinion about labor unions has changed now that no one is in them. So this just completely changes the way we think about organizing class. The way that a lot of the people in the DSA and in activist groups have responded to that is tenant organizing and debt organizing. I am not against tenant organizing. I want to be very clear. I'm not against tenant organizing and debt organizing. It has a low bar of entry. You just go in, you start getting people to work together. The problem with it, though, is on the success criterion. It is totally dependent on bourgeois law. There is no way to stop production. And you can say, oh, well, you can stop paying rent. The landlord can still valorize the value of that property without you paying rent. It is different than a factory or even stopping services. So what we have thought about is like, we need these tenant unions and we need to look at these worker situations, but we need these, what Daniel was talking about, we need a cultural stable way to build a socialist and proletarian culture that is not just marketed to us, are based off of cultural signifiers like the populists do. Like, in America, it's like, well, you're driving a pickup truck, which happens to cost $300,000. And, you're wearing Carhartt, which is $50 in a shirt. and all this stuff that is a cultural signifier of manual, not just working classness, of manual labor in specific, but often has nothing to do with manual labor in the way it's expressed. But you'll hear people talk about, oh, we need those people, we need to look like that. That's how we appear to the proletariat. And our contention, Daniel and I have both lived all over the country. I come from some of the more conservative areas of the United States. Daniel's been through that, but he comes from, well, you come from historically a rather mixed bag of that. But we have really thought about this as like these cultural signifiers don't actually signify very much. Like there are plenty of, blue-haired lesbian working class people.
Right.
There just are. There are trans working class and lumpenized people all over the place, actually. No, they're not a majority because they're not really a majority anywhere. But they do exist. And so I think that is both why you've seen this switch to cultural signifiers, because no one knows how to deal with the decline of these mass institutions. And to make it even worse, gig work and what my friend Nico Villarreal calls the petty bourgeoisification of the working class makes it even harder, because famously 4 years ago, I think it was 4 years ago, California put in a referendum to treat Uber drivers as employees, and the Uber drivers themselves were not particularly happy about it. They wanted the benefits of protected work, but they also like the idea that they're not managed. But they are managed, but they don't. It's not obvious. It's hidden through an app. So that also makes the obvious, like the state of contention of who you're fighting, a lot harder for most people involved in gig work to identify. They're not quite sure who their enemy really is. They might feel like it's an app, right? They might feel like the app is screwing them over, but we always have to remember the algorithms in these technologies were built by somebody on purpose for a reason. And so like it can occlude who you're actually angry at. And the other thing I think it leads to is a lot of anger at this professional strata, not even because they're responsible for this, but because they're the people you can actually get to. So these consequences for us are profound. The other thing that we have to just admit, and I will turn it over to Daniel, is that the interest of the working class split up in these sectors are not always clear. The broader overall interest for the abolition of property and all that is still the same as it was in the 19th century. So this is why we're like, the idea that we need to give up on the proletariat that was pushed by like post-Marxists and Euro-communists in the 80s and 90s, we throw that out. But the immediate demands are often more at odds than people see. Now, that's always been a little bit true, and Marxists have never quite had an easy way of handling that. But when you have mass labor organizations, that was easier to handle within the labor organizations, and that was easier to coordinate between the labor organizations. And particularly before Taft-Hartley was passed in the United States, they did. Now that's both legally prohibited, but also structurally a lot harder to do. So, we basically say the consequences for class organization is that you're going to have to be really, really creative and diffuse on this, with the goal of building a party, because the unions are not going to be able to cut it. They're too small a portion of the population. But if you just declare a party, you're going to end up a sect, or at best the Green Party, which is like gets 2% of the vote every couple of years. It doesn't really matter here. So this has to have a long-term view of building these things up to have multiple institutions that could form into a party, which is also, our model is actually based on 19th century Germany.
Yeah, brilliant. I would add a bit on the sociological and ethnographic side of our research. We consulted the field of working class studies, which is an academic field, and they analyze very rigorously the condition of the work. This old Engelsian idea of the condition of the working class. And some of the findings are startling, but there's a kind of mismeasure in terms of the intensity of the empirical crisis and the liberal institutions that are able to absorb or process the level of social breakdown. We theorize this in a bunch of different ways. There is a tendency towards a liberal horizon of a way out or of an exit, which kind of goes back to this thesis of the ubiquity of this petty bourgeois form of culture that is imposed upon the working class. Jennifer Silva's work has been very influential for this book, but also for my work. And what she indicates is that there has been a theft of social reproduction that makes certain basic equipment goods removed from the working class. The family, right? The tendency of the neoliberal period from the early 80s till now is assertive marriage. People marry no longer. I mean, one of the good things about the 60s, of course, was people got married across classes, frequently. It doesn't happen much anymore. And so you find not so much cultures of pathological working class life, but you find that's not what you find. You find a kind of fragmentation and a profound atomization. But you also find, and this is where I think socialist civil society work can be done, you also find a lot of commonality in terms of what Silva refers to as a mood economy, where things like therapeutic modalities become the replacement for old promises that were in the welfare state offered to the working class. So there becomes a grittiness, there becomes a strength that is quite hidden, quite beneath the surface of working class life today that should be brought out in culture, brought out in novels, brought out in films, brought out in aesthetics, and so on. The problem, of course, is a lack of resources. The bourgeois academy and the bourgeois institutions are not necessarily interested in spotlighting that. I'm of the view that it's important that we do actually do because it would actually change the sort of direction of what we're trying to ameliorate. There's a certain weird situation where a lot of the maxims, you could call them kind of maximalist positions of 60s politics, let's take family abolition, for example, just, structurally, empirically doesn't resonate with the working class to insist upon abolishing the family, given that the forces of capital have certainly done that already in a certain way for many. So this leads to passivity, this leads to depoliticization, and it leads to resentment, So that needs to be faced head on, it cannot be ignored. And I think one of the problems would be working class studies has nothing to say about changing that condition. All they really can do academically is kind of reveal it. And I would contend that it's quite difficult for folks to sort of face, but maybe social, that's the only way that it could be faced is through a sort of strengthened and sober socialist analysis. We try to provide a bit of that. I'm writing another book as a follow-up that will go into more detail on this. And there are a lot of good writers that are analyzing this question, which really emerges, in the early 90s and late 80s of what we call the working poor. And the working poor has grown. It's grown, especially after the pandemic. And now with the cost of living crisis, it's an invisible acute crisis in the US, invisible. And it's furthermore stoked by the state and by the liberal parties, because the liberal parties have created what little vestige of the welfare state is available to, fund a lumpen element of the working class, which locally has the reverberation of intensifying that resentment amongst and internal to the working class. So there's so much that needs to be done. There's so much that needs to be constructed so that we can salvage that hidden strength that does exist, but which doesn't have, that doesn't seem to have an outlet.
I want to pick up a term that you have been mentioning quite often right now. This is that the particularly grim but necessary concept in your book is the active process of lumpenization. You describe this not as a static group, but as an ongoing process of social, psychic, and cultural decay. Who are today's lumpen, and what would a socialist response to lumpenization actually look like?
Oh boy. I'll start us off, but I want to give Daniel credit for some of this. And again, this came before we even talked about the book. I was responding actually once to a footnote in Endnotes Volume 4, believe it or not. And it's an essay called A History of Separation, where they talk about the lumpen was constructed as a kind of counter image for the working class to make it seem respectable. And they talk about the incoherence of Marx's category. Well, that sent me down a path, and I was like, that doesn't feel true to me. But I also get that when you read the list that Marx put in the Brumaire, it does kind of seem like people who annoy him that day. So I started looking at other things, and I looked at this liberal educational sociologist, Ruby Payne, who had done working class studies stuff, also racial and gender studies on the prevailing attitudes of certain classes in the United States in regards to education and how they went about this. And this was work done in the 1990s. And I had pointed out in the work of Ruby Payne that things that she had attributed to the underclass had actually now been seen further up the class ladder. And so I was like, no, there's something to this lumpen problem. Conversely, and it's actually thanks to Daniel, as one of our first interactions, actually about 4 years ago, somewhere in there. He told me to look into the work of Clyde Burrow, who's a scholar out of Texas, who wrote a lot on the lumpen proletariat and their relationship to Trumpism, but also wrote a whole lot on this category being incredibly difficult for the Second International to handle. And like, if you read Marx's letters, even he had at one point come up with like a 2-tiered schema, like the true lumpen and the lumpen so-called, which included seasonal service workers and people and the elderly who didn't have pensions, who were in and out of work and precarious, and thus also seeming to get to that whole, dynamic that everyone points out about the lumpen. Like, if you've ever like sat through an undergrad seminar, where if you're lucky enough to be taught Marx in the United States, which is rare, they will still talk about like, how is the lumpen not also the reserve army of labor? And part of it is. And what we started looking at with gigification is like, no, we see these processes way more entrenched and deeper in different categories of society. For Marx, the lumpen was a result of classes that had lost their function and they had no support system. And so they would basically, in some ways, parasitic on the working class. Now, you can argue that putting sex workers in there or organ grinders is not really actually parasitic on the working class. But Daniel said that what was interesting about Burroughs' book is that it actually implies a process, because the lumpen, by Marxist definition of class, cannot be a class. It cannot be a class in and of itself. It is made up of different class origins, and it has different relationships to production itself. And today, I'd even argue, like, there's things like the lumpen bourgeoisie, like large hotels or even like quasi-state agencies in certain areas of the world, who have ties to the state formally and to businesses formally, but are also the U.S. mob even would be an example of this. That it's even hard to see them as like a victim class. However, they're highly appealing to both liberal technocrats and populist, because they provide a good imago of suffering. Because of all the pathologies, they have negative effects. You can think about in the United States, this is a cultural artifact. I have no idea if this ever even went to Germany, but if you see the movie Precious, which is basically like the worst poverty porn I can ever think of. But the issue is, if you look at things like the breakdown of the bourgeois family as being allowed for the proletariat, that we see that clearly. We see drug addiction on the rise in all classes, but the proletariat doesn't have the resources to handle the addiction. So one of the things that you see is these social pathologies we don't think are unique to the working class at all, but the working class doesn't have the resources to absorb them in the same way. And so this means that the lumpenized are everywhere. They come from all classes. They are people who are being decayed out of the structure, but have not completely fallen. And unlike in the past, I would say, Daniel and I would say, a lot of these people still have, to some degree, levels of formal employment. So they're not even outside of the formal labor market. But gray market operations are so common in the United States due to the underemployment of people in the labor sector, that these touchstones that were normally associated with criminality in the past are all over the place. And what we have seen, we didn't speak about this so much directly in the book that much, although it did come up, is that these lumpenized traits are first treated as victim statuses, and then they're celebrated as if they are good. So, for example, one thing of lumpenization isn't obvious, but as a person who both struggles with weight, so I speak with this from myself, and come from the blue-collar working classes, my origins, alcoholism and being overweight are endemic, all right? And there was a shame movement in the aughts. That went away. It also wasn't effective. And then there was a celebration that first was like, don't stigmatize people, which I agree with. Actually, it doesn't help. This is a social problem. Two, this is not a problem and we can celebrate it. And then Wegovy happens and even that goes away. So, which for those of you who don't know, that's the diabetes drug that causes massive weight loss, is that and Ozempic. So what do we see? We see these traits of lumpenization first be treated as something that makes someone a noble victim, then be treated as a social problem that's no one's fault, which we agree with, then be valorized as something good and not harmful in and of itself, as a cultural pattern. This is because we think this ties into the cultural war element. And it's also because today, since lumpenization happens because of the gig economy, because of the insufficientness of the welfare state, because of 1,000 reasons, to put it in a kind of grimmer way than even William Ply lumpenization, Mike McNair in our book release actually pointed out that, that we shouldn't say the welfare state's gone, because even in neoliberal countries, it exists enough to stop mass death of the proletariat, but not, I would say, mass physical death, but maybe not mass social death. And we've looked at the work of like studies on men by Richard Weeds. We look at effect on women's from working class studies and feminist studies, and we've seen stuff like working class women are more subjected to domestic violence. They're more working class men are more likely to not have a partner and have no access to kids. 1 in 8 working class men in America not just they're not married, they don't have a partner, they don't have children at all. They don't have contact with people like even of the opposite sex that much. And this leads to all kinds of lack of socialization and asocialization that is now not just in a group that we can stigmatize. So the lumpen, we just get rid of them. We can just throw them out. We have to deal with the working class itself. Now we have to deal with these problems because so much of every class strata is tied into it. And to tie it back to the PMS, PMC thing a little bit, the new petite bourgeoisie, and then I'll turn this over to Daniel because this is a lot of his specialties of study. But they are going through this too, but it hits them very differently because they do have
safety net,
the resources, and the safety net, if generationally, to handle it, that parents who have their baby boomer parents have wealth that can help them get through it, et cetera, et cetera. But that is also going away. So those resources are dwindling too.
And they're then the last generation, because if they're the lumpen, there's no safety net for the next generation.
Correct.
Yeah, it's a verb, not so much a noun for us. It's an active process of decomposition, which we can say rationally has a direct bearing on the politics of interest. We see that policy-wise, the voting patterns of lumpen populations will tend to vote against labor on the whole, and for kind of more narrow, particularistic, identitarian types of interests. On the right, the lumpen tendency is for the preservation of the status quo as defined by the financial aristocracy most often. And this I think is the best way to understand Trump as a kind of lumpen state, where increasingly sort of we see this celebration of kind of open forms of oligarchic capitalism becoming normalized. This is an expression of a kind of cultural lumpenization in a certain way. I think there's a certain danger here for socialists, whereby we don't want to opine for some resurrection of a working class morality. It creates a real conundrum, though, you see, because Friedrich Engels had the idea that, yes, there was an element of lumpen who are crooks, scoundrels, and knaves. We see this a lot in the Brumaire, right? But there's another element, which he called honest lumpen, and they are potential allies to the working class interest. So if there are not institutions made in the interest of labor, putting aside whether we're talking about, labor unions in the narrow sense, but parties and civil society institutions that actually construct ways of seeing social reality through the prism of labor struggle as a centrifugal reality of our social life, liberalism will continue to abuse the lumpenization problem. It will function also as an ideological thing. So I think, again, it kind of feeds back into this problem that our book tries to isolate of the institutional absence of organizations and educational opportunities for people to see the centrality of labor, not so much the centrality of the working class, but let's say the centrality of the schism between capital and labor as the primary schism of capitalist society. One of the things we didn't say, is that populism famously is a Manichaean conception of a division, right? But it's not the division that Marx and socialists affirm between capital and labor. No, theirs is more intra to the elite. There's a good elite and a bad elite. Choose the best side. To us, this is really flawed, So lumpenization will continue unabated with the status quo. If the status quo remains, it will continue this way. That's what the bourgeoisie wants. Lumpenization will fragment the class. And this is exactly what bourgeoisie needs. They need that fragmentation to grease the wheels to maintain the status quo. I think at the subjective, experiential level, right, lumpenization has kicked up a lot of difficulty and a lot of toil and struggle, which again is a kind of a type of invisible struggle. I'm reminded here even of, a lot of work in the Second International on the lumpen was quite interesting. I don't support all of his stuff, but even a thinker like Jack London, the people of the abyss, all of his ethnographic research into the slums of London and the fisheries of Alaska, very interesting stuff on the lumpen, I would contend that more needs to be written there from a socialist perspective. I'm so tired of these studies of the contemporary working class through a liberal sort of pandering lens. It really bothers me, If you're going to write about the working class, you should have the dignity to write about it so that their agency is what is trying to be restored and centered. So it's so seldom do we see that.
Yeah, I was going to say the liberals always love to look at a broken tractor and then blame the driver. So you just need a better driver. No, the machine is broken. I'm sorry. You can change the drivers as much as you want. But let's go in, here because you advocate for a revitalization. You already mentioned that quite numerous times, but please, maybe just a little more flesh on the bone here. You advocate for a revitalization of the classical merger thesis, originally championed by Kautsky and Lenin, the deliberate fusion of socialist theory via intellectuals and a spontaneous worker movement. But the new working conditions, deindustrialization, and also the lumpenization. But the new working conditions that you mentioned make this kind of organizing very, very hard. Some would argue impossible. How would you counter this?
I mean, they do and they don't, I would say, and I'll kick it to Derick in a moment, but they do in the sense that gig work creates an acute anxiety. Unemployment creates an acute anxiety where your time is no longer in your control, in your measure, and even the problem of otium itself emerges almost as a socialistic demand, I would say. In fact, this is something that we have a deficit in speaking about today, of free time and the demand for free time. Some communists talk about it, but more needs to be centered on this, in my opinion. But free time for what? Free time for a type of active leisure that would enable critical thought. I think that in utero, our idea is that we already have pregnant within the podcast sphere, within the left counterpublic that we inhabit, even though we're highly under-resourced. It's not as if we're getting big grants from the financial elite or
even progressive PACs, even like it's not like we're getting big grants even from progressives who have money.
Right. But I would contend that the desire for a form of critical thinking is already pregnant within the working class. We should not fall into this populist pandering and presume that it's not, right? Or fall into some academic form of thinking that really only thinking. This is very segregative logic, and I think it's very much embedded in the neoliberal university that through the division of labor, those who think when they are sanctioned and permitted to think through a graduate program. This still remains a highly seductive way that many people on the left still, I think, embody this conception. You know, we're of the view that through our Patreon, through our podcast and so on, that there has to be another way to think about the cultivation of fugitive time that you break from the boss, where you do, in fact, engage in study on the boss's time, not yours. This is how things work. There has to be a break from this rigid liberal division of labor for the cultivation of something, whether we call it the Gramscian organic intellectual or we call it something else. The point is it doesn't really matter what we call it. The point is that socialism necessitates critical thinkers. I would say socialism necessitates the cultivation of like something like a social philosopher. Every worker has this embedded. I mean, if a worker is thinking about their condition in the world, are they not thinking like an intellectual? They are, right? So, of course, you know, there's a whole number of ways this can go. I don't know if Derick wants to jump in, but maybe Derick, you can describe, you know, for listeners, you know, what the Kautskian vision, because we're linking to the neo-Kautskian strategy, which is a very specific strategy of contemporary socialism, which we are kind of sympathetic to, right? Not in some kind of dogmatic way, but we really think that they're onto something. This is actually useful, and the merger thesis is a part of that. It's a part of that. And there's a lot of barriers to it. And I mean, I feel it myself as somebody who was raised by parents that had no formal education. So all of my advanced education was itself outlaw or was never really meant to be, you know? And I kind of see myself as having to have fought to be there. But that desire is a precious desire that I think every worker should be given the chance to cultivate that critical modality. Oh, now, of course, with that said, I'm not saying every worker must obligatorily be an intellectual. No, of course, it's not like that. But what I wish to stress is that the opportunity is too often foreclosed, is too often the reserve of the academic. There has to be another way to think about it. And there's a strategic element to the merger thesis. But I'll kick it to Varn to elaborate the history and talk about the strategy as well.
Yeah, so to kind of pick this apart, the Kotskian and Lenin line is an illumination of the merger thesis was done by Lars Lee, the Canadian academic who wrote a massive treatise on what is to be done called Lenin Rediscovered, which focuses on the continuity between the Second International and the Third International on this issue. We were specifically, I mean, one of our editors asked us, well, how is this just not vanguardism where you're telling the workers what to do? And I'm like, okay, the classical merger thesis, and even in Lenin, the party merger here with the intellectuals is not so the intellectuals can dominate and strategize the workers. It is actually so that they can educate the workers about concepts that are already nascent to the working class's own experience, but they don't have names and rationale for. So it is a pedagogical project, even in party politics, more than it is a logistical one. Today, it is both harder and less hard, I think, to conceive of this. And it's harder because party institutions don't exist in the United States. They're basically illegal. It's not just Taft-Hartley. It's also state regulations about what parties can do as political parties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But things that make it easier, Daniel and I are both from the blue-collar working class. We have different experiences with this. My mother wanted me to get an education because she was a blue-collar woman in the 60s who actually got into Georgia Tech, which is a very prestigious university for our region, but was not allowed to attend because it was both not of her station and not something that her parents thought she should do. So I was encouraged to get a higher education. So it's a little different than Daniel's experience because my mother was not allowed to, and she didn't get one until she was 40. But my father was a mechanic and my mother was a waitress until she was 40 years old. And then she was a nurse. And she quickly actually nurse Jackie'd herself. And that's a reference no one in Germany is going to get. But to explain that to you, that's a show where you have a working class woman working as a nurse. She's educated herself, but the stresses of it get to her and she gets caught up in pain management with drugs and becomes an addict. And that happened to my mom.
Isn't the actress that plays Nurse Jackie the actress that plays Carmela Soprano?
I believe so,
okay.
Yes. So yeah, maybe you will get it. But I bring this up as kind of an illustration of the way we all live in this. So in one way, we have two things that would actually help the merger thesis that's different in the past. You have massive amounts of trained professional intellectuals being forced into proletarianized positions. You also have a lot of blue collar people who came up at the end of the 20th century who were encouraged to go into higher education for good and ill, and who may not have the social connections to land a regular job in an elite institution. So a lot of us go back and forth between teaching community college. I mean, I teach at a community college. I teach at a high school. I do this other thing too. In other ways, it's easier because there's more inroads to the working class. But this idea that I get from left populists who are almost all college educated, I think sometimes is their reflection on what they think the background of people they both valorize but kind of have contempt for have. Because I always point out that if blue collar people can't understand this, how the hell do I exist?
Right.
How did I get into this situation?
But the other thing I wanted to say very quickly and just hold your thought, the narrative of to become radical or to become politicized so often for working class people by origins actually occurs once you've hit and seen firsthand the intense contradictions that professional spaces have. I've seen countless books written by academics that begin with this type of confession, you know. It's a bit taboo, but people say it. You know, Derick and I both have spoken a lot on our shows about it. And one of the things the merger thesis could do is redefine this, redefine the basis of how we conceptualize what it means to be radical and militant in a different way. I know that it's a tall order perhaps, but it's something that I see as central. I see as central because you see a lot of this is built upon a lot of Marxism that we haven't talked about, that we address in the book, from like, you know, Herbert Marcuse to Adorno up to Laclau and Mouffe, which basically argued through the notion of the integration thesis that the working class is pacified. And one of the outcomes of that thesis is that politicization doesn't really happen there. And I think that has become a bit of a fait accompli. In other words, the intellectuals have proven this negatively to actually be how it is. I think a merger thesis would upend this, would complicate this. It would have to. Sorry. Oh, please go ahead, Varn.
Well, the other thing that we think that we should be doing, not so much, you know, yes, it would be great if we had a, you know, early 20th century style SPD. We're not going to mention the post 1914 SPD. We're just going to pretend that doesn't exist for a little while.
Thank you.
But a pre 1914 SPD. But we don't exist in that world. And what we've been looking at is like, yes, it's actually true. The SPD formed at a low moment of workers' education in Germany. But that high moment of workers' education and the revolutionary period before it in 1848 sets the precursors for anything happening. And that was as much, you know, for all of our talk about, you know, the culture wars and how we hate them. We realize that we do have to intervene in culture as well, particularly on this issue. But what you have to do is, and this is where it gets a little, this is what I think is the hard part. You have to convince these intellectuals that you're not using socialism to save their status quo, that their status quo cannot be saved. You're not going to get, you know, oh, free university does not lead to everyone going into university and we all have university jobs. And yet I hear this all the time, like, oh, that's a way to handle excess capital. And I'm like, it's never going to happen. Why would we even do that? Like, I believe in socialized healthcare as a capitalist concern. I also believe it as a socialist concern if we had a socialist society, but it's also a capitalist concern. I don't oppose it at all. But in some ways, what they're championing is actually return to the Fordist status quo or the social democratic European status quo of a generation they don't know. And our contention is that led you here in the first place. You have to give that up. So one thing that you have to convince people of is that it is in these intellectuals' best interest to serve and subordinate themselves to the agency of the working class. That's a tall order, because the one thing we agree with the people who critique, you know, the merger thesis, oh, it's vanguardism. No one likes being told what to do. And I'm like, well, when I hang out with like blue collar workers, they like me telling them facts quite a bit.
Yeah, they're interested.
Don't find that condescending. Right. What they don't like is me telling them what to do with those facts. And so, you know, I'm not going to pretend like my audience is all blue collar working class, but there's a lot more, even when I do demographic searches, than you'd expect, given what less popular say. I hear all the time, you talk over the workers' heads. And I hear it from college educated people. And then I'm like, well, that's funny because I have a bunch of blue collar workers who support my show and my actions. The other things that we have to do is convince people who are in hybrid positions of which Daniel and I actually are. Like we are in some ways both petty proprietors and working class people ourselves. Like I draw a wage, but I also sell a podcast. That the position that they actually earn the basis of, and that's hard, but it's something we must about a lot of these precaritized and lumpenized gig workers who also need to view themselves as part of a working class that they are effectively still in, but don't have the same relation to as traditional factory workers.
Let me come to my final question for today. I have one more. If the dead ends of Democratic Party tailism in the US or reformist cartel parties in Europe are undeniable, where do you see the seeds for genuine class-independent institutions today? What is the first step towards pulling today's hyperpolitics off its rhetorical cloud and grounding it back in the material reality of exploitation?
Yeah, this is hitting on the strategy question very nicely. I suppose, in a sense, there's a big debate happening right now in the socialist left in the US about the question of a socialist party and the question of the role of what we can do to facilitate, to accelerate the possibility of something like the reconstitution of something like a Debsian socialist party, which of course earns our respect, as you'll remember in the book, precisely because it was so adversarial to the establishment and to bourgeois politics. So in that sense, for the first time, you know, socialists in the US were able to formulate a platform of demands where co-optation was not an issue. What would that look like now? We're very far away from any kind of notion that we could project that is too premature. We would want to start more modestly to begin to push out and expand a lot of the educational possibilities that are already present within a lot of the para-academic and podcast and counter-public work that we already do. Given the profound stats and empirical data that Derick had already mentioned in regards to existing labor, we're not sure that we can put all of our cards into that basket. Also, given that the ideological and educative prospects of reforming a lot of those professional mindsets that color those institutions is very difficult for us to facilitate, because they too are very bound up with a lot of these bourgeois interests and so on. We invoke Badiou, Alain Badiou, the communist philosopher, and his conception of subtractive politics. And we sort of say, like, he's both right and wrong, because he's rightly criticized for advocating subtractive politics. By subtractive, he means that the only means for communism to rejuvenate itself is to radically go local and to radically disengage from all forms of bourgeois politics. We see this a bit as a quietistic ultra-leftism, but ideologically there's a lot of truth in it. So there has to be a sort of embrace, at least at the level of what he's saying ideologically, but without sacrificing the possibility of revolutionary social democracy. And revolutionary social democracy ties us back to this notion of the neo-Kautskyist merger thesis, for which we have sympathies with DSA in the US. We have critical, you know, we're very critical of the foundation of the Michael Harrington approach, which for your listeners, I don't know how many are aware, but we talk about in the book, you know. And in fact, we say the founder of DSA, this guy Michael Harrington, former Trotskyist, possesses a commitment to left populism, and that this commitment to left populism also necessitates, in a very strong categorical way that the DSA will never break from the Democratic Party. He's quoted saying this many times. And we see this fatalism as potentially what makes the DSA not the best vehicle for the propagation of socialism, that Harringtonite struggle. I would leave it to Derick to comment on that because he's currently in the DSA. Maybe he's more optimistic than I am about that. So I'm not sure. I think, we're at a I think Anton Jaeger in his book Hyperpolitics is correct that the workers' movement, the best analog historically for where we're at now, is really just at the beginning of the fragmented early workers' movement that had very little institutionalization. So in that sense, we need a plurality of experimental strategies, and I think this is what I would say, and kick it to Varn.
Yeah. I mean, so I joined the DSA shortly after Mamdani came into office, and I've been tailing the DSA as a scholar for a decade or more. In fact, my first encounter with the DSA was in 2008, believe it or not, back when they were 4,000 people, mostly who were fans of either Cornel West or Barbara Anwak. There are people in the DSA that will tell you the Harringtonite tradition died in 2015 with the lead up to the Sanders movement, and that fundamentally changed the nature of the party. I say it is true, and it's not a party. It's the other problem. The DSA will speak about itself as a party. It's I won't get into the technicalities of it. It's actually legally a political advocacy NGO. What's weird about it as a political advocacy NGO is usually the particular category of NGO that it is used to hide finances, and the DSA's is transparent about where they get their money from and who it goes out to. They don't have to be. But they are actually today more reliant on the infrastructure of the Democratic Party than they were even when Harrington was alive. So I'm asked to use ActBlue, which is a Democratic Party donation platform. DSA and non-DSA populist candidates are often backed by the same super PACs. Our Revolution, Justice Democrats, Super PAC, and they're backed by the same agencies. The biggest one is Fight Agency, which comes out of the John Fetterman campaign, which I think in and of itself should concern people. The reason why I entered into the DSA was that before Mamdani won in New York, there was a mass movement within the DSA to finally start seeing itself as a separate party. Since Mamdani has won, and the organization is now almost a New York organ. By that I mean 1/5 of the organization is actually not even in New York. It's in 3 boroughs of New York: Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. But its representation in Queens is minor, and then Long Island and the Bronx. And the Bronx is the most blue collar of the New York boroughs, are not represented. That's also pretty clearly tied to the coalition that brought Mamdani into office. So since that's happened, you've seen a turn back explicitly to left populism and to slate candidates. The issue that you have is the ballot line that they would want to do to form a party within the DSA or to split from it. In the United States is state level, and like almost all the states, illegal. This is not understood by the DSA itself, which is weird to me.
Should be bread and butter.
Yeah. They often, I mean, like when people say we're already a party, and I'm like, you're an NGO. Quit lying to yourself. The major parties in the United States are not NGOs, because if they were, their spending limits and stuff would be constrained by law. They can't run candidates on their own ticket. And as I've said, as long as you're within the Democratic Party ticket, you are subject to Democratic Party apparatuses. And this is true for Mamdani too. And in fact, in a recent debate with some of these people within the DSA, Daniel and I pointed out all the ways in which the victories they are claiming unique to the DSA are actually just expansions of prior Democratic policies in New York City, not been exportable to their cities by and large. We need class-independent institutions to build that party from. I do think the DSA could be that, and it was heading in that direction until Mamdani. But the moment they started getting local electoral wins again, they abandoned it. And I want to point this out. You'll hear that DSA candidates are doing incredibly well. They are in New York. They did okay in Seattle. They've done okay in Colorado. They've done decently in, I said Seattle. Yeah. They've done okay in Chicago. They have failed astronomically in California. They have had no push into non-blue states now, which they used to actually have. Now they don't. And they lose about as many of their primary runs as they win. In fact, I participated with one that lost here. And when I was listening to the DSA people locally talk about it, and I'm going to be very vague because I do keep my comrades' confidentiality secure. People were talking about our candidates if they weren't in the Democratic Party, while also talking about the need to be in the Democratic Party simultaneously. So their ideology is incoherent. I'm hoping we can intervene. What worries me for you guys in Germany is that this model has been exported to Die Linke explicitly through like Jacobin Europe. And this seems to me to be a disaster. It barely makes sense in our context. It makes no sense in yours.
And can I add one little thing there? It doesn't help the wider objective that Derick and I are trying to hit at of worker independent politics, because so much of the DSA recycles a petty bourgeois paternalism, which is frankly often about the desire to reform the parents, the progressive centrist parents. And this repeats itself a lot. And what it actually does is it keeps a kind of elitism in place where the DSA becomes a reflection of the consensus of the Ivy League. And in a way, then this like PMC superstructure thesis that we're critical of actually proves to be accurate in a certain way, or predictable, right? Where you do have a young vanguard of petty bourgeois aspirants trying to just make their parents just a little bit more progressive, but that's it. And then we call that socialism. The danger with that, of course, is that when that fails, socialism as this signifier will be seen as the cause, because it's the boogeyman, it's the outlaw word, right? So I'm highly cautious. I'm highly cautious, and I don't want to be, giving a kind of doom and gloom Jeremiah here. But part of our book also, as you probably indicated, is that, we're both 45. We've been around the block. We've seen how this thing works. And sometimes you just have to tell the truth about it. It may be painful, but.
Yeah, one of the things I want to maybe as our last thing, you mentioned hyperpolitics, which is a concept by Anton Yeager. We use a lot of Anton Yeager's other book. He wrote with Anthony Borriello on populism. We don't so much use the hyperpolitics in our book because I don't think either one of us had finished reading it by the time we wrote it. Maybe Daniel had. I had not. Now I've read it, and I wish I had included more of it. Because one of the things that he points out that this leads to is this very thing to tie it back to Stuart Hall, is a politics that isn't actually a politics. So in the DSA, there is a politics, right? It does have some effect. I would agree, though, ultimately, even the people who say they are workerist, and a lot of the DSA does, like they say they're against liberal identity politics, or that they want to liberal identity politics, even though they also replicate it all the time. But it's an internal battle within the DSA. The issue that I have is
despite all that talk, the conditions of being limited to a specific sector of the working class, not that they're not working class in all entirety, but the sector that is the working class part of like, you know, what Plancis would call the new petit bourgeois, it actually becomes more and more dominant, even the more they talk about the workers. And the example that I want to put out in my own chapter, because now I remember I can talk about it from real experience. The neighborhoods the DSA pulled from initially was on our west side, which was highly immigrant, highly poor, highly blue collar, with a bunch of college students who had to live out there because that's where they could afford. Mm-hmm. All right. That was the class mixture of the DSA in 2017 here, 2018, 2019, when they became a full chapter. In 2022, even though there are a lot of people who are not college educated in our DSA chapter, we are more and more located, and our actions and stuff are involved in the richer parts of town. That pattern you see in New York, where it's profound. The DSA's largest boroughs are Brooklyn and Manhattan, which are the richest. They're not the richest people in those boroughs. I don't want to imply that. That's not true, but that's where they're at. The most active DSA chapter in California is probably in LA, and then the next one's the Bay, two of the richest counties on the planet. Yes, they also have plenty of poor people and plenty of very lumpenized people, but that's who's there. It's the highly lumpenized and the professionals. Now, the DSA actually doesn't handle it very well. They lose, even though they're big there. They don't know how to navigate the politics. What I'm afraid of is what I see in the DSA, and I'm going to talk about, I'm going to be honest in ways that might get me in trouble. But most DSA chapters have a 1-to-5 ratio or a 1-to-6 ratio of people who will even vote on links they're sent to formal membership. So membership engagement is low. And when it comes to actually showing up to meetings and actions, it's about half of even that. So my chapter of 600 has about 50 people who regularly show up to things and about 100 people who regularly vote. I've talked to people. This is the pattern throughout the country. So when we talk about the DSA's infiltration in the society as anything other than electoral apparatus right now, it seems relatively thin despite its numbers. And also, let's remind people of the scale here. The DSA, even in paper members, is only about 105 to 107,000 people. The United States is 320 million.
It's a fraction.
It's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. It's just that the left in the US has been so small since the 60s that it seems massive. So, you know, the comparisons are the CPUSA in the 1940s, which was about 80,000 people, although it was a lot more involved to be a CPUSA member than it is to be a DSA member. So it probably means something different. And then the Students for a Democratic Society, which was probably about 40,000 members and a smaller population. So it was probably around the same percentage of the of people. I bring all this up because now the DSA is really highly concentrated in a few cities, and it is basically becoming a caucus within the Democrats. And there's an open internal kind of Cold War with the DSA with itself here. So you have the partyists and who were ascendant, now they're kind of losing. Compared with people who call the parties crazy and want the New York DSA to be taken as a model because the New York DSA is so heavily tied into the Democratic Party. And so what for most DSA members this leads to is actually a form of hyperpolitics, where politics is seen as posting or supporting candidates you cannot vote for and will not help you. Whether it's Graham Plantner from a very small state in Maine, where the majority of his donations came from outside of his state, or, you know, and the PACs around him. He wasn't a member of the DSA. That needs to be very clear. he was recruited by people around the DSA and then rejected it, as Daniel brought up. But they nationalized the scandals around him to get donations from DSA members. My point about hyperpolitics is we tend to think hyperpolitics is cultural, but when you're supporting candidates that do not legally represent you in any way, how is that not just a cultural fixation? So that's also happening. So what so now the DSA is increasingly seen as a way for progressive politicians to get money outside of not from the DSA itself, because the DSA can't give them that much money. And the other
outside
thing
donations.
From outside donations because of their extensive networks. And then to tie this in a little bit more, when the DSA abandons a candidate, like they did Jamal Bowman because of his incoherent stances on Israel, and he attacked them back, you even see DSA electeds from members who will use the DSA as a scapegoat for their failure. They will blame the DSA as undermining them, et cetera, et cetera. This is not just centrist. This needs to be pointed out. And this has already happened with people that the DSA now claim as part of its coalition in New York. Brad Lardner, one of the people in Mamdani's slate, was a member of the DSA who left it because it was too radicalized. Mamdani actually got DSA endorsed candidates to leave the field so Lardner would not have opposition from the DSA. And then when the DSA slate was not fully endorsed by Mamdani, they were quite mad. But when Mamdani's slate won, they claimed his slate, even though within it was a person who condemned the DSA. So you see this strategy of hyperpolitics everywhere in this movement. And the issue with the DSA is right now it's where the people are. It's where all the groups are liquidating to, because what they see, and they're not wrong, is the Democratic Party central apparatus is in free fall. The DNC is in millions of dollars in debt. The money in the Democratic Party exists, but it's not in the Democratic Party itself anymore. It's now in these progressive and also regressive super PACs. And so the DSA is one of the most organized people to intervene, but they're not the only people. That's the other thing. There's a counterforce of former Republicans who used to be neoconservatives who are also doing the same tactics and taking over former centrist seats. So I predict that if we continue heading down this way, the DSA is going to be pulled into a Democratic Party elite civil war and not really have that much pull on the greater working class outside of New York, Seattle, maybe Denver, maybe Chicago. And we're a federated country. That's 4 states out of 50.
All right. Okay. Thank you for that. I have to wrap it up now, unfortunately, because in 10 minutes we have our own live show going on in Berlin. But thank you so much for this really thought-provoking and also in-depth interview about your book. I can only wholeheartedly recommend everyone to go and read it and then maybe check out this episode again for additional input and cross markings. Thank you so much for being on the show. It was a delight. Hope to see you soon, or hope to see you again sometime to any relevant topic, maybe discussing the demise or maybe even the Phoenix-like resurgency of the DSA or something like that. Okay. It's been great. Any last words from you guys?
Bring us to Germany.
Oh, I'd love to.
Somehow you come up with the money, of course, and then we'll come. Yeah,
cool.
Go
for
we
a
are
beer
doing
and
a tour.
debate.
We are doing a tour in the U.S., but maybe in time we'll try to make it across the pond.
Yeah, maybe you can come to the studio and we can do this in person one time.
Yeah. I can relearn how bad my German's gotten in 20 years. All right.
That's okay. That's okay. Then and if it's not bad enough, I start speaking Bavarian because I'm actually from Bavaria, and then you will feel like, what language is that guy even speaking?
I actually lived in München for 9 months. So Bavarian German is the German I butcher.
Okay, that's good because I'm Munich, born and raised. Okay. So take care and see you around. And everybody in the audience, have a great time and see you again. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99ZUEINS.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.